Okay, so this is our final video. This will probably be a short one, just like the previous one, and we're going to sort of wrap everything up and conclude and talk about sort of, again, so the long-term implications of the role of slavery and the rise of capitalism. So as we saw, the need for royalty, particularly the Spanish monarchy and the Portuguese monarchy, to secure wealth had become a sort of dynamic new phase in the emergence of what will eventually become capitalism, the way they dealt with the crisis of feudalism. And one of the things that happens is it marks the rise of plantation slavery that linked different parts of the global economy in new ways. Now, built into this is sort of a periodization. We started by looking at Spain and Portugal. And what's important to note here is that what we saw with Spain and Portugal was a kind of, if we want to call it capitalism, which, as I said, in some ways, early Spanish and Portuguese colonialism had more in common with feudalism, or in the case of the Portuguese, had more in common with that simple carrying trade that had emerged in Venice, the Hanseatic League, Portugal, and then, of course, eventually would reach to the Dutch. This was crown capitalism, if we want to call it capitalism. It was the monarchy using its military might and slavery in this period to enrich itself through colonial expansion. Often the use of indigenous native labor gave way to what was eventually racial slavery that emerged in the Caribbean. The Dutch, of course, play a crucial and central role in the kind of middle part of the chronology. And the Dutch enter the African slave trade and scale it up to a much larger sort of intensification. In many ways, they provided, as we said with Robin Blackburn, sort of the shock troops of global capitalism. They provided the emergence of things like sugar, that would become central to the rise of capitalism, especially in Britain. We saw latecomers like the French and the British trying to emulate the success of the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese. Even though the British and the French do not find gold and silver like they would hope, in a way, there was sort of a serendipity of history which allowed them to be more successful. One of the limitations, of course, of silver and gold is its effects. As we saw, it was inflationary. And also the crown, you couldn't make more of it. Once the mines depleted, there was no more silver to extract. But with the case of sugar, tobacco, and plantation agriculture, you can constantly be replanting and replanting. And of course, they do it for centuries, well into the 19th century. And even to this day, there's sugar plantations all over the world, some of which have existed since the 1700s at this point. Now, one of the reasons sugar is so important is that it is the first sort of mass commodity that existed. When sugar is transported back to Britain, it is used in tea and coffee. It wasn't just wealthy people that were buying sugar. It was everyday people could afford to buy sugar. It was the first consumer product, if you will. So we still see these elements of capitalism that, even though many scholars had seen slavery as sort of a relic of its feudal past, we actually see that in the case of sugar, slavery is central to the emergence of capitalism because it creates the first mass-produced product. The first consumer product that is consumed by the British working class. They're taking sugar, which is concentrated calories, combining it with the caffeinated effects of tea and coffee, which provided the fuel for people to work the hours that they did in the Industrial Revolution at this point. And of course, tea would also be central in another major conflict in the emergence of capitalism, when the British go to China to trade because they have an insatiable appetite for tea. And of course, the Chinese look to what the British have to offer and say, well, you don't really have anything we want in return as far as trade, but we will accept payment in silver, just like they accepted payment from the Spanish in silver for Chinese silk. And this creates a problem for the British, largely because you have an outflow of currency, hard currency in the case of silver, to China. So the British sort of currency supplies or silver supplies are being depleted in exchange for what? When you think of tea, it's dried leaves. Even though it's a consumer product, this becomes a problem. All this hard currency is leaving England for China, and the silver supplies of China start increasing. So the British, of course, don't like this. So instead, they start to sell opium to dealers in the Pearl River Delta. The Chinese, of course, the Chinese government, Imperial government, tries to ban the sale of opium. The British go to war with China and eventually win, and this leads to what becomes the unequal treaty system, where sort of the great imperial powers of Europe and eventually Japan carve up China. They never formally colonize them in the way that they do India, but create these sort of spheres of influence. The British emerge, in a way, as the first international drug traffickers. And this also has consequences to the other part of the British Empire. India. specifically because that's where they were growing the opium. And we sort of see a similar effect that the textbook described with cotton. And one of the effects is that there's so much money to be made in the opium trade with China that so much of agricultural production, specifically in northern India, is turned over to opium production. So, like with cotton, Indian industry never gets to develop along its sort of own lines because the British specifically use it for the extraction of raw materials. And we also see the other negative effect, which is cotton becomes so central to early British industrialization. The early industrial revolution in England centered on the textile trade, the creation of clothes and fabrics. And those fabrics came from the production of cotton. They also emerged in the northeastern United States in a place like Lowell, Massachusetts, which we'll look at next class. So early industrialization does not happen without the production of cotton as an agricultural staple crop. And of course, we know that the production of cotton was done almost exclusively under slave labor. So slavery was central in the production of the raw material that fueled the Industrial Revolution in both Manchester and Liverpool and Massachusetts. And of course, because the British are able to produce cotton at such a large scale, not cotton, but are able to produce textiles at such a large and industrial scale, it becomes so cheap that the textile industry in India, as the textbook points out, or the readings, virtually vanishes. And the Indian economy basically starts to work in reverse through most of the 19th century. It becomes, I don't want to use the term deindustrialized because it's not industrial, but it becomes less productive. There's no incentive in India to create a kind of productive center. Instead, India becomes a center for the production of, or the growing of opium for China, and also, especially after the American Civil War, when the British stopped buying cotton from the South because of slavery, that they shift over to India. And India then becomes much like what the Americas was initially, sort of raw agricultural products to supply the growing Industrial Revolution in Europe. And manufactured goods are then sold back to India, which underdevelops its industry for over a century and a half as a result of that. And it creates what many and sort of historians call a kind of center and periphery theory, whereby a sort of center becomes a much more developed, economically advanced region, and it basically underdevelops the region where you get commodity staple crop production. Now, that's it for today. Next week, what we're going to look at is the emergence of class and class formation in capitalism. If we look at this next slide, we're actually going to read Karl Marx himself and Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto. Many of you have probably heard of it, but maybe many of you have not actually read it. And we'll also look at another a work of history by a historian named Bruce Laurie, and we'll look at the household to the factory system in his book, Artisans into Workers. All right, that's it for now.